The world needs to experience you so it can grow and expand through your human experience, also creating a point of connection with other humans who may be going through similar experiences as you are. Welcome to On Emergence, a podcast on what it takes to be a human being. My name is Laura Sagan. I'm your host and a fellow human being. In this podcast, we talk about various topics, various extensions of what does it take to be a human, using different modalities, different lenses of often philosophy, psychology, ancient wisdom, spirituality. So if you have been asking yourself questions that you may not know the answers to, or sometimes wouldn't even know what the question would sound like if you were to put it in words, you're in the right place. Welcome. Last night, I was talking to a friend of mine who is a visual artist about certain insecurities that she sometimes feels about putting her art out there. And it actually inspired this episode. That conversation is really what made me think about, well, what is art? I mean, I think about the subject quite often because the way I look and relate to the world is that art is everywhere. If something is an expression of who you are and provokes emotion in a fellow human being or many human beings involved, then it is art. And then I turned to Google and ChatGPT and asked it for a definition of art. So I'm going to read it out. According to Oxford Dictionary, art is the expression or application of human creative skill and imagination, typically in a visual form, producing works to be appreciated primarily for their beauty or emotional power. So to me, it sounded a little bit like a very dry definition. It's kind of focuses on the fact that the container in which art is delivered rather than the emotional capacity that art has. And then there is another definition that resonated so much more with me, and it is a definition by Tolstoy. He describes art as a means of transmitting emotion from one person to another, fostering shared human experiences. And that definition resonated a lot more because art is an expression of who you are. Art is expression of your experience of being a human. It's an expression of emotion to other humans. And once it's out there, other humans can recognize the similar emotions that they may have experienced by interacting with your art. So in that case, it raises the question, well, can art be good or bad? And in a sense, based on the definition that we just described, that art is something that stirs up emotion, bad art is something that doesn't stir any human emotion, something that leaves a person indifferent as they interact with a piece of art. And I want to steer away a little bit from art being only contained within the visual form, because there are other forms of art like music, performances, that stimulates other senses of us. And some art forms, for example, I consider events as an art form because events stimulate all our senses. And in that case, a lot of the things that we consider not art or we don't come to think about as art can be considered as such. Now, why this topic of art is even becoming important in this day and age, I find that we focus a lot about what is the outcome of our action. But art is an expression of self. Art is something that your human psyche, your humanness really needs, because by putting your art out there, you're exploring your emotion. You're exploring your emotion, whether you're splattering pain on the canvas, and actually you're splattering your pain and your paint on the canvas. Or art can be considered the work that you're doing. So your day-to-day work, you could be a developer, you could be a project manager, that can be art, because what you're creating, if you're to focus on what you're creating and what kind of emotion does it stir in the end user, then anything can be art, or at least a lot of things can be art. Art is creativity and imagination. And in that sense, that you creating something new that hasn't been experienced before, you reimagine it into a piece of art, whether it's performance art or paint art or music or your work can be art. And it is also a unique expression of who you are, because you are unique and your art by definition will be unique. So even if you were to copy an artist completely, that is still going to be a unique interpretation of who you are, because copying an artist in and of itself is going to be that journey behind it, your emotional journey. And if we were to put, say, Van Gogh paintings side by side to the one that is made by you, you explain your emotion behind it, then that suddenly becomes art, because your story, your interpretation of experience of Van Gogh painting, even if it's a one-to-one copy, if it's possible, it still becomes a unique interpretation of your reality, of your human experience. What is it that has led you to come up with a copy of art? What was the emotion that you were experiencing as you were trying to create it, as you were creating it? Another point is expression and communication. So your art is an expression tool, and it also a communication tool. So you're expressing yourself to other humans by creating the art form of your choice, of your choosing. And it is also a communication tool in that sense that you're communicating your experience to other humans. And that's one of the reasons why I find music so powerful, because it can really transcend distances, it can really transcend cultures and play on the strings of so many people's souls at the same time. So the impact of music, that's not, I wouldn't say that is my favorite form of art, or maybe I could, that's debatable. But in terms of the impact and music being as a communication tool, I find it incredibly powerful. So if you were to think about your next creation of art as this tool of communication rather than something that needs to look good or aesthetically pleasing, then perhaps you would be a little bit less worried about creating and bringing that art into the world. I guess the concern here is that your art will be misunderstood by the person who is engaged in it. And of course, that's always a risk. You can attach a story to it, a little explanation of what is it that has moved you to create this specific piece of art. Or you can leave it as it is and allow the freedom of expression to speak for itself, and allow to also see that maybe other people are able to see something in this art of yours that you weren't able to. Because that is also a beautiful invitation that if you were to paint a painting or write a piece of music or write an essay, write even a social media post can be art. With intention, crafting your Instagram caption, that can be art. And if other people see something in it, wouldn't it be a very useful invitation potentially for you to explore a different aspect of your own expression and interpretation of your human experience? So in that case, creating art, even though is misperceived by other people or misperceived according to your measure of misperception, then it's still art. If it still stirs emotions in other human beings, then it's art. And it's a beautiful art. It's a powerful art if it has moved someone. If it has moved one person, including yourself, that is art. So in that sense, you can't create bad art. The bad art that you can create is only the one that doesn't engage you or other people. For example, painting a wall, it can be considered art, and it also can be considered not art. Because if it is something that there's no intention behind it, that there's no thought of feeling invested to it, that it's purely a process, then painting a wall is not art. But if you were to approach to painting your wall creatively, let's say inviting friends over for a little get together and them helping you paint the wall together, creating this shared human experience, this shared connected human experience, then suddenly painting a wall becomes a piece of art. It's a point of human connection. Another point that I wanted to mention is the aesthetic experience. There was an exhibition in a gallery where the gallery was completely empty. There was no art hanging on the walls. And the art was that experience of emptiness in the gallery. Can this be art? Can it be aesthetically pleasing? We're kind of entering into this gray area, but to me, it's not actually gray area. This is art because it stirs the emotion behind the emptiness of the gallery, the experience of emptiness, and maybe the engagement with other people who also came by to the same gallery to experience the same emptiness with you. Now, this is art. If it creates a point of human connection and shared human experience, this is art. Another useful aspect in creation of art is its cultural aspect as an interpretation of your current experience, of your current exposure to the culture that you're living in. And it also invites a unique interpretation of your human experience of the current culture, this documentation of the current state of affairs from the perspective of a human lens, from the perspective of emotional lens of human experience. And that's why we're able to really connect of what did it feel like to live in the 70s when we're watching not just a movie, but when we're observing art forms from that time, when we observe the type of performances that artists began to put out in those years before. And it also invites a unique interpretation of your human experience of the current culture. It becomes a chronicle of the current state of affairs. What kind of art do we create right now? Whether it's the art on social media that you're creating with your next Instagram story, even, which only lives for 24 hours, what kind of art do you create then? What is the current interpretation of your human experience that you put out there? Now, this steers us into the next point is what is not art. It's something that I already touched before, is that a form of art that doesn't engage another human being into the story, into the emotion behind that art, or doesn't stir any emotion, that in my books can be considered as not art. So something, or rather bad art, something that doesn't engage anyone. So, for example, as I put out this episode and then there's no engagement, then there's no emotion that has been stirred out by putting out this episode and sharing my thought, then I would say, well, this was not a successful episode in a sense of that didn't create the human engagement and a human point of connection as I would have wished to. It doesn't mean that it won't later on, maybe in 2 years down the line, YouTube picks up on the algorithms and this episode is going to be blowing up. I don't know. However, what is important to me is the presence of intention behind putting my art, which I consider this podcast is a form of art, is my expression of human experience. What I consider important is my own journey with that. And I hope that by creating this form of art, I can engage other humans into the emotion behind this episode, also allowing that emotion can be completely different from what I had in mind when I initially created this episode. Because this is art. It's literally just last night, I had a conversation with a friend that inspired this episode. And just last night, I was thinking about, okay, which episode is going to come in the next queue and kind of designing this overall experience of this podcast. And now it's an expression of who I am right now, captured in the moment of time. There is another argument to be made. If something is a pure functionality without any intention, then it is not art. In that case, like I mentioned an example with painting a wall, that it's purely functional, then in that case, it's not art, it's a chore. And of course, one can debate that is still an art. If someone engages with the paint on the wall, that is art. And then we're really going into the nitty-gritty details. But I would like to hear what do you think about with if painting a wall with a normal white paint can be considered art, and when, in which instances can it be considered art, and in which instances it cannot. Because, of course, painting the wall white color, it means that you're creating an overall atmosphere into a space. However, what if you were painting a wall to sell your flat, for example, or to make sure that you get your deposit back? In that case, can it be considered art? Somehow I feel that it wouldn't, but I would love to hear from you to see what you think. Finally, last point I wanted to touch about is the importance of creating art. And this is something that Rick Rubin had mentioned in his book and also in his interviews, that art is something that a human soul needs. Art is an expression of self. Art is connection to the source, is the connection to something bigger than you. There's something that is behind you that you can't quite capture in your physical form. So you kind of almost pull it out from the ether and put it out into a canvas or a piece of music or a piece of written word. And in that case, also it creates another point is, what can business be considered an art form? When I started my last company, it really was an art. Like the way that I built it as an ecosystem. I thought about the community, I thought about the product, I thought about the overall experience. So to me, my business, my company was a form of art. And now that it's done, it's wrapped up, and I look at it proudly. To me, creating businesses is art form. And that's actually often a question that I ask people: what is your art? How do you express yourself? Or how do you let your soul express itself? And the thing is, your soul needs that expression. Your soul needs to have the space to expand to. And your art form, whatever medium of your choosing, the world needs to see it. The world needs to experience you so it can grow and expand through your human experience. And in that, also creating a point of connection with other humans who may be going through similar experiences as you are, However, most importantly, creating art is important for yourself. Creating art is important because you're throwing your emotion, your experience into a physical form. And it is through the journey that you're able to understand what was that experience. You're kind of getting a third point perspective, an outsider perspective, when you created that piece of art. One of the reasons why art considered therapy, because you're expressing your emotion and then you're able to engage with it from the outsider view, outsider perspective, which is why so many people find art when they're going through a depressive episode or when they're suffering from depression, is because it allows that expression of emotion. So no longer that emotion is sitting within you, almost poisoning you. So it's very important, create art. In whichever form resonates with you, create art. And I'm really curious to hear, what is it, the art that you're creating and you're currently engaging your soul in, or what type of art that you would like to engage yourself in and why. I hope it stirred up some questions. I hope it stirred up a little bit of emotions, because this is art. This is art for me. As always, I invite you to subscribe to this channel, to this podcast on YouTube and Spotify. There's also a newsletter on the website on emergence.com. And I would love to hear from you. We can connect on Instagram. The handle is on emergence. I will see you next week. Once again, I'm Laura Sagan, your host and a fellow human being.